Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. Before you do anything else, before you scroll, before you swipe away, I need you to look at this. Tehran's own state media is telling its own people that air defenses just lit up over the capital, not over Bandar Abbas, not over some island out in the strait, over Tehran itself. That has not happened casually in this war. That is a five-alarm moment, and I'm going to walk you through exactly why, minute by minute, target by target. So stick with me, because in about 30 seconds, this is going to click into place, and you're going to understand something that most of the news anchors covering this don't even fully grasp. So here's the moment. CENTCOM says it wrapped an evening wave of strikes on Iran at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, which is 1 EM in Baghdad time, roughly 90 minutes of continuous operations. 90 minutes doesn't sound like a lot until you realize what can happen in 90 minutes when you've got fifth-generation strike packages working in sequence. And almost immediately after that window closed, Iranian state media, specifically the semi-official Fars News, put out a line that should stop you in your tracks. They said Tehran's air defense systems were activated to counter, quote, enemy reconnaissance aircraft. Now stay with me for 1 second, because that phrase is doing a lot of work. When a regime tells its own population that air defenses are up in the capital, they're not just talking about a stray drone. They are telling 40 million people in and around that city that somebody, somewhere, thinks American or Allied aircraft might be operating over Iran's most protected airspace. That is the headline before we even get into the footage. And I want you to actually see it, because seeing it changes how you understand it. A resident in Tehran told CNN they were woken up by a loud explosion around 4 in the morning local time. 4 in the morning. That's not a rumor, that's not a Telegram channel, that's a named international outlet reporting a named account from someone who lived through it. Tasnim, which everybody needs to understand, is basically the mouthpiece of the Revolutionary Guard, confirmed separately that air defenses were activated in both the eastern and the western districts of the capital. East and west. That's not a localized jumpiness at one radar site. That's a citywide posture. So hold that thought, because we're about 30 seconds in, and I already want you to notice something. This didn't start in Tehran. It started somewhere else entirely, and Tehran was just the loudest echo of it, because the actual operation, the one CENTCOM is officially attaching its name to, was centered hundreds of miles south of the capital. The target list, in CENTCOM's own words, was Iranian command centers, air defense sites, missile and drone capabilities, and coastal surveillance facilities. Read that list again. That's not a symbolic slap. That's the connective tissue of an entire regional military apparatus. Command centers are where the orders originate. Air defense sites are what's supposed to keep the sky closed. Missile and drone capabilities are the actual weapons that get launched at tankers and at American partners in the Gulf. Coastal surveillance is the eyes that let Iran track shipping through the Strait of Hormuz in the first place. You take all 4 of those out in the same 90-minute window, and you're not poking the regime. You are trying to blind it, disarm it, and cut its communications all in one night. The specific geography matters here too, so let's slow down and actually map this. Bandar Abbas, that's the big one, a key Iranian naval hub that sits right on the mouth of the Strait of Hormuz. If you wanted to draw a single dot on a map that represents Iran's ability to project power into that waterway, Bandar Abbas is that dot. Alongside it, Greater Tunb Island, one of 3 islands sitting near the entrance to the strait that Iran has for years, called its unsinkable aircraft carriers. Coastal defense batteries and cruise missile sites on that island got hit in the same wave. So think about what that means. The islands Iran brags about being unsinkable just took direct fire, and they didn't sink, sure, but the hardware sitting on top of them absolutely did. Now here's where it spreads, and this is the part that I think gets lost in a lot of the coverage. Iranian state media is reporting explosions far beyond just the coast. Keshem Island, south of the mainland, Sirik, Chabahar, Kanarak on the southeastern coast. And then, and this is the part that should really get your attention, strikes further inland, Rask, Kondab, Khorramabad, Semnan. Semnan is not some border town that's deep into Iranian territory. And Al Jazeera's own correspondent reporting from inside Tehran said the main building of a civilian airport in Semnan was hit with what he described as minor damage, and that a storage facility in that same city was also struck. Now I want to be careful here and give you the responsible version of this, because Iranian authorities themselves said there were no casualties reported in Pakdasht, and no injuries or deaths in Semnan, according to a senior security official quoted by IRGC. So even Iran's own state broadcaster, in the middle of a war, is not claiming mass casualties from every single one of these hits. That matters, because it tells you something about the nature of these strikes. This looks like a campaign built around infrastructure and capability, not indiscriminate area bombing, and I think it's important that you hear that from me plainly, instead of just assuming the worst based on the explosion footage alone. But let's not pretend this war has been bloodless, because it hasn't. And I'm not going to sit here and pretend otherwise. Iran's own Ministry of Health has said that at least 35 people have been killed and more than 300 injured since this latest round of fighting reignited. 35 dead. 300 wounded. Those are Iran's own numbers. Not an American estimate, not a think tank guess. When you're getting casualty figures from the health ministry of the country being struck, that's about as close to a hard floor of the human cost as you're going to get in real time. And I think you deserve to sit with that number for a second before we move any further, because behind every one of those figures is a family. And war is genuinely a tragedy, even when one side is the aggressor state that started all of this by attacking commercial shipping in international waters. Now, remember I told you 30 seconds in that this was going to click. Here's where it clicks. Iran didn't just sit there and absorb this wave. Within hours, retaliatory strikes were launched against American assets scattered across 3 separate countries. And I want to walk you through each one individually, because the details matter enormously here. Start with Kuwait. Iran's own military said, through state media, that it struck Patriot missile batteries and fuel tanks used by American forces at Ali al-Salem Air Base. Now here's the thing about that claim, and I want you to remember this because it's going to come up again and again in this war. Kuwait's own government said it intercepted 4 cruise missiles and 21 drones launched from Iran between Wednesday and early Thursday. 4 cruise missiles. 21 drones intercepted. Not one of them, according to Kuwait, got through to actually damage a Patriot battery or a fuel tank. So you've got a direct contradiction between what the IRGC claimed on state television and what Kuwait, the country actually defending its own airspace, is telling the world. That gap between the propaganda broadcast and the intercepted missile count is a pattern you need to learn to spot in this war, because it repeats constantly. Then Bahrain. The Iranian army claimed drones targeted communications equipment, a Super Hawk radar system, and Patriot air defense installations at Sheikh Isa Air Base, home to American forces. Again, an Iranian claim of a hit on some of the most sensitive air defense infrastructure America has forward deployed in the Gulf. And again, no independent confirmation from Bahrain or from CENTCOM that any of that actually connected. And then Jordan, which is honestly the wildest claim of the 3. The IRGC put out a statement addressed directly to the Jordanian people, saying it had, in their words, targeted and destroyed the American fighter jet storage ramp and a new American command and control center at a large base in Al-Azraq, Jordan, using Khyber Shekin ballistic missiles. That's a specific weapon system named, a specific base named, a specific target type named. That's not vague bluster. That's Iran trying to claim a very precise strategic win. Except Jordan's own military said it intercepted 8 Iranian missiles earlier that same day. 8 intercepted. So once again, you've got Tehran's broadcast painting one picture, and the country actually on the receiving end painting a completely different one. So what do you do with 3 claims like that? You do what I always tell you to do on this channel. You treat state broadcast claims from an active combatant as claims, not facts, until there's independent verification. And right now, the independent verification from Kuwait's own defense ministry and from Jordan's own military is telling a very different story than the one coming out of Tehran. That's not me being biased against Iran. That's just basic wartime media literacy. And honestly, it's the same standard I'd apply to any government's claims in the middle of an active shooting war, including our own. Now let's talk about the maritime side of this, because this is where things get really interesting from a legal and strategic standpoint. And I think this is honestly the most underreported piece of the entire week. CENTCOM said its forces disabled a commercial oil tanker, the Curaçao-flagged MT Belma, as it tried to sail toward Karg Island, which everybody needs to understand is Iran's single most important oil export terminal. According to CENTCOM's own statement, the vessel ignored multiple warnings as it attempted, in their words, to violate the blockade, and a U.S. aircraft disabled it by firing Hellfire missiles into the ship's own smokestack. Not into the hull, not to sink it, into the smokestack, specifically to kill its ability to move without killing the people on board or spilling the cargo into the Gulf. That's an incredibly precise, almost surgical use of force, and if you know anything about how a Hellfire missile actually engages a target, that kind of precision targeting on a specific structural component of a moving vessel tells you exactly how advanced the sensor-to-shooter chain is that's operating out there right now. And CENTCOM didn't stop at just that one line. They said that during the first 24 hours of enforcing this blockade, they redirected 2 compliant commercial vessels and disabled 1 non-compliant vessel. Redirected 2. Disabled 1. That's the entire blockade in a single sentence, and it tells you the rules of engagement here are not chaos, they are calibrated. Comply, and you get redirected. Don't comply, and you get a Hellfire through your smokestack. That's the choice Iran's blockade running strategy is now up against. And it's not a comfortable choice for anybody trying to move oil out of that country right now. Let's pause here because I promised you engagement every 30 seconds, and I meant it. So here's a question for you to sit with while we move into the next section. If a single tanker heading toward Karg Island gets disabled with this level of precision, what do you think happens to the next 50 tankers that try the same run this month? Drop your prediction in the comments, because I read every single one of them, and I want to know if you think Iran's oil exports survive this blockade in any meaningful form through the rest of the summer. Now here's a thread that I think deserves way more attention than it's gotten in the mainstream coverage, and it's the legal dimension of where this war might be heading next. Al Jazeera's own correspondent reporting from Washington said President Trump has increasingly signaled a willingness to broaden the scope of military operations, not just against storage depots, missile launch sites, and naval vessels, but potentially against what could be considered civilian infrastructure, specifically power plants, bridges, and other parts of Iran's infrastructure. And the reporting was very clear on this point. That kind of targeting is, in the words of that same report, legally very questionable, and it has already drawn criticism against the administration earlier in this war. Now, I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not going to sit here and pretend I can adjudicate international humanitarian law in a YouTube video, but I do know enough about the law of armed conflict to tell you that dual-use infrastructure, things like power grids and bridges that serve both civilian and military purposes, sits in one of the murkiest, most contested zones in the entire framework. If this war expands into that territory, you're going to see a genuinely different global reaction than what we've seen so far, and I think that's worth flagging clearly instead of glossing over it. All of this is unfolding against a backdrop that a lot of viewers might not fully remember, so let me reset the timeline for you quickly, because context is everything here. This war originally began on February the 28th, with joint Israeli and American strikes on Iran. There was a ceasefire, there was an April truce. Then, less than a month before this exact wave of strikes we're discussing, Washington and Tehran actually signed a memorandum of understanding, extending that earlier ceasefire and laying out a path toward actual negotiations to end the war for good. A memorandum of understanding. That's diplomatic language for both sides, putting something in writing that they were supposed to honor. And yet, here we are, with both governments now publicly accusing the other of violating that same agreement. So, somewhere between the signature drawing on that memorandum and the missiles flying over Bandar Abbas, something broke down completely. And I think understanding that collapse is actually the key to understanding everything else happening in this war right now. So let's talk about the platforms, because I know a lot of you come to this channel specifically for the technical breakdown, and I'm not going to skip past it. When CENTCOM describes hitting command centers, air defense sites, missile and drone capabilities, and coastal surveillance facilities in a single 90-minute window across multiple simultaneous geographic points from Bandar Abbas all the way up to Semnan, that tells you this wasn't one squadron doing a single pass. That's a layered strike package, and the doctrine behind it is actually pretty elegant once you understand it. You typically need an electronic warfare and suppression element going in first, hunting radar emissions, and either jamming them or targeting them directly with anti-radiation missiles, because you cannot safely fly strike aircraft into contested airspace with active enemy radar still painting your formation. Then you need precision strike aircraft, actually delivering munitions onto fixed, high-value targets like command bunkers and known missile storage sites using targeting pods and satellite-guided weapons that can hit a specific building rather than just a general area. And then, especially for deep or hardened targets, you often need a standoff capability, something that can launch a cruise missile from well outside the range of remaining air defenses and let that missile navigate autonomously the rest of the way in, so the launching aircraft never actually has to cross into the most dangerous part of the threat envelope. When you put those three elements together, suppression, precision strike, and standoff, operating simultaneously across a spread-out target set, that's what a real, professional, coordinated air campaign looks like, and it's a world apart from what Iran's air defense network appears able to answer with right now. And speaking of Iran's answer, let's talk about the one claim on their side that actually deserves a real technical look, because in the middle of all this, the IRGC said it intercepted and shot down a US MQ-9 Reaper drone over Andameshk, in Khuzestan province in the southwest. Now, the MQ-9 is a remotely piloted aircraft. It's not cheap, and it's not something you'd want to lose, but it's also not a manned aircraft. So if that claim is accurate, it represents a real capability demonstration from Iranian air defense without costing a single pilot's life on the American side. That's actually the more concerning outcome for Iran in the long run, not the less concerning one, because if you can only manage to bring down unmanned platforms while your own command centers, radar sites, and coastal batteries are getting systematically dismantled night after night, that tells you which side currently holds air superiority in this fight, and it's not particularly close. Now, let's talk about the defensive side of this equation for a second, because Iran's air defense claims against Kuwait, Bahrain, and Jordan all ran headfirst into the same wall, and that wall is called Patriot. The Patriot system is a layered, radar-guided surface-to-air missile network, and its entire job is to detect an incoming missile or drone, calculate an intercept solution, and put a kinetic kill vehicle directly into its path before it ever reaches the base it's protecting. When Kuwait says it intercepted 4 cruise missiles and 21 drones, that's not a vague boast. That's a specific number tied to a specific radar and fire control log, the kind of number a country actually publishes, because they can back it up with tracking data. Same with Jordan intercepting 8 incoming missiles. These small Gulf states, Kuwait, Bahrain, Jordan, are not sitting there unprotected. They are sitting behind some of the densest, most heavily reinforced integrated air defense coverage that the United States and its partners have assembled anywhere in the world, precisely because everyone knew this exact scenario. An Iranian retaliatory salvo across multiple bases in a single night was always the most likely form this war would take once the shooting resumed. So when you hear the IRGC claim a destroyed fighter jet ramp or a wrecked command center, and then in the very next breath you hear the host country say, here's exactly how many of those missiles we shot down, that's the difference between propaganda, built for a domestic audience back home, and a verifiable engagement log built for a public record. I want you to keep applying that same test to every single claim that comes out of this war going forward, because it will save you from getting misled by either side. Let's shift gears for a second and do a quick roundup of what else matters in the region right now, because this conflict does not exist in a vacuum. Pakistan, which has actually played a real diplomatic role trying to mediate peace talks between Washington and Tehran in recent months, publicly said it is following, in its foreign ministry's own words, with deep concern the recent incidents that are further escalating regional tensions. Think about that for a second. A country that was actually at the table trying to help broker peace is now watching that same peace process get blown apart in real time and saying so publicly. That's not a great sign for anybody hoping this ends quickly through diplomacy rather than exhaustion. And zoom out even further, because oil markets are already reacting to every single one of these developments. With Iran's blockade attempts in the Strait of Hormuz colliding directly with the American naval blockade enforcement we just talked about, you've got 2 competing blockades effectively squeezing the same stretch of water. And global energy markets are pricing that risk in almost in real time. Every tanker that gets redirected, every tanker that gets disabled, every night of strikes on coastal infrastructure. That's not just a headline, that's a variable feeding directly into the price you're going to pay at the pump, no matter what country you're watching this from. Now, while all of this has been unfolding around Tehran, there is another front you genuinely need to be tracking, because it's happening at almost exactly the same time. And it tells you something about how strained global air defense networks are right now everywhere at once, not just in the Gulf. In Ukraine, Russian forces launched a strike on a ship near the southern port city of Odessa that killed at least 10 people, according to Ukraine's own Seaports Authority, which said a Guinea-Bissau flagged vessel carrying corn with a crew from India and Syria was hit, though 8 crew members were rescued. Odessa's regional governor said Russian strikes have now killed 28 people in that city in the month of July alone. 28 in one city in 1 month. And Ukraine has not been sitting still either. Kyiv launched hundreds of drones at Moscow, a day after Ukraine's own capital was hit by one of the heaviest barrages of ballistic missiles of this entire war. President Zelensky himself confirmed Ukrainian strikes on a Russian oil depot, on logistics facilities in the Moscow region, and on 6 vessels in the Black Sea. Ukrainian drones also hit warehouses belonging to Wildberries, essentially Russia's version of Amazon, near Moscow and in the Tambov region, and according to reporting from the Moscow Times, that strike alone killed 8 people and injured more than 70 others, with Russian analysts estimating the total economic damage at up to 100 billion rubles. That is one of the costliest single strikes on Russian commercial infrastructure of the entire war. I bring this up not to distract you from Iran, but because I want you to understand the actual global picture right now. You have 2 major simultaneous air campaigns, one in the Gulf and one in Eastern Europe, both hammering command centers, logistics hubs, and infrastructure networks night after night, and both testing the absolute limits of what modern air defense networks can actually intercept in real time. That's the world we're living in this July, whether the headlines connect the dots for you or not. Before we go any further, I want to flag something that I think most coverage of this war completely glosses over, and it's genuinely one of the most important numbers in this entire story. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has publicly estimated that this war has already cost the United States roughly $37.5 billion. $37.5 billion. And that estimate came directly from testimony defending a funding request to Congress, not from a leak, not from a think tank. That's an on-the-record figure from the man running the Pentagon. Every single strike package we've walked through today, every cruise missile, every Hellfire through a smokestack, every 90-minute wave over Bandar Abbas, all of it is stacking on top of that number in real time. So if you've been wondering how long a campaign like this can actually be sustained, that dollar figure is exactly where you start looking. And I'd genuinely love to know in the comments whether you think Congress keeps funding this at the current pace through the rest of the year. Now let's pull all the way back and do the strategic level analysis, because I think this is where the real story actually lives, underneath all the individual strike reports. What we're watching is Iran trying to run a dual-track strategy simultaneously, and it is coming apart at the seams in real time. On one track, you've got continued rhetorical defiance, retaliatory strikes against American partners across 3 separate Gulf states in a single night, and state media claims of destroyed command centers and downed drones designed for domestic and regional audiences. On the other track, you've got a signed memorandum of understanding from barely a month earlier that was supposed to be steering this entire conflict toward a negotiated exit. Those 2 tracks cannot coexist forever. Every night that CENTCOM successfully hits another command center, another air defense node, another piece of coastal surveillance infrastructure, Iran loses a little more of its ability to coordinate that dual-track strategy at all. You cannot simultaneously wage a calibrated shadow war and pursue serious negotiations if the actual command and control apparatus that would let your military calibrate anything is getting dismantled piece by piece. That's the trap Tehran currently appears to be caught inside of, and it's the reason I think you're going to keep seeing this pattern repeat. Air defenses activated over the capital, retaliatory strikes claimed against multiple Gulf partners, independent intercept numbers from those same partners telling a much smaller story, until either a genuine ceasefire holds this time, or the campaign widens into exactly the kind of civilian infrastructure targeting that reporting out of Washington is already warning about. I want to be honest with you about something before we wrap up, because I think you deserve straight talk rather than hype. I am not embedded in a briefing room, I don't have classified access to this specific operation, and neither does anyone else making videos about this war on this platform. Everything I've walked you through today comes directly from CENTCOM's own public statements, from Al Jazeera's on-the-ground and Washington reporting, from Kuwait's defense ministry, from Jordan's military, from Iran's own Ministry of Health and state broadcasters, and from residents who spoke directly to international outlets. I've tried, deliberately, to separate what is confirmed from what is merely claimed by one side or the other, because in a war, this information heavy, that distinction is honestly the entire job. If you found this breakdown useful, that separation between fact and claim is exactly why. And it's the standard I'm going to keep holding every single video on this channel to going forward. So, where does this go from here? Since this exact wave of strikes, the broader campaign has continued to escalate rather than cool off, with reporting indicating the United States has now carried strike operations across 11 consecutive nights, alongside continued Iranian claims of retaliatory attacks on Gulf-based American assets. And there is one specific site you need to have on your radar going forward, because President Trump has now named it directly, more than once. It's called Pickaxe Mountain, known inside Iran as Ku-e-Kolangazla, a heavily fortified underground complex south of Iran's Natanz enrichment plant. According to reporting from Al Jazeera and satellite imagery reviewed by the Institute for Science and International Security, construction at that site began back in 2020, with extensive tunnel excavation dug beneath hundreds of meters of solid granite, specifically to survive bunker-penetrating munitions. Iran has never granted UN inspectors full access to verify what the facility is actually for. Tehran says it's for assembling centrifuges. American intelligence sources have raised the possibility it's meant to function as a hedge for a covert enrichment capability. President Trump told Hugh Hewitt directly, quote, "We're going to take out Pickaxe Mountain. Tell the Iranians to be ready," and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has since told Congress that if anyone on Earth can reach anything buried anywhere, it is the United States military. Iran's own Qatam al-Anbiya military command has responded by calling any strike on that site an explosion of war in the region and threatening the interests of America and its allies broadly. So when you ask where this goes from here, that mountain is very likely the honest answer. Whether Tehran's air defenses light up over the capital again tonight, whether the next tanker near Karg Island gets redirected or disabled, whether the legal line around civilian infrastructure holds or gets crossed, and whether Pickaxe Mountain itself becomes the next target on CENTCOM's list, all of that is still being written in real time, and I'll be right back here tracking it for you as it happens. I want to know what you think happens next. Do you think Iran's command and control network can survive many more nights like this one intact? Or do you think we're watching the actual collapse of the regime's ability to fight a coordinated war in real time? Do you think the next major escalation comes from the American side widening the target list, or from an IRGC miscalculation that actually lands a hit on U.S. personnel somewhere in the Gulf? Let me know your read in the comments below. I genuinely read through them, and they shape a lot of what I dig into for the next breakdown. If this kind of detailed, source-by-source walkthrough is what keeps you coming back to this channel, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button and tap the notification bell. Because when a night like this happens, I want you seeing the breakdown within hours, not days. And if you want to go even deeper on how modern strike packages, command structures, and combat decision-making actually work behind the headlines, that's exactly the kind of material I put into long-form pieces for the channel's community, so check the links below if that's something you're into. One last thing before you go, and I say this in almost every video, but I mean it every single time. Wars like this one produce an enormous amount of noise. Unverified telegram clips, out-of-context footage recycled from previous conflicts, and confident-sounding predictions from people who genuinely have no more access to the real picture than you do watching from home. My promise to you on this channel has always been to slow down, name the actual source behind every claim, whether that's CENTCOM, Al Jazeera, Kuwait's Defense Ministry, Jordan's military, Iran's own Ministry of Health, or a resident who spoke directly to an international outlet. And to be honest with you, the moment something is a claim rather than a confirmed fact, that's a slower way to make a video. It is also, I think, the only responsible way to cover a war that is still actively killing people on both sides while we sit here and talk about it. Tehran's skies lit up over air defenses tonight because somewhere out there, actual pilots and actual missile crews are making split-second decisions that will be studied for years. And the least I can do from this chair is make sure the story I bring you afterward is as accurate as I can possibly make it. Thank you so much for watching, for reading the sourcing carefully alongside me, and for trusting this channel to walk you through a story this serious with the care it actually deserves. Stay safe out there, stay informed, and I will see you in the next one.